Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome. Pleased to have you here to joining us. My name is Ed Barrett, and I'm the moderator for the keynote speaker address. I want to remind you that during the session, we would invite you to submit questions throughout the session, and we will deal with a number of those questions at the end of the session. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Rita McGrath. Dr. McGrath is a highly sought-after speaker around the globe. She's the author of a number of books, including the bestseller, The End of Competitive Advantage. She's a frequent contributor to a number of publications, including Fast Company, the Wall Street Journal. And with that, I'll turn this over to Rita.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you, ICD, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually, although I'm very sorry I won't be in Halifax to share some time with you. What I thought I'd share is some perspectives that I think are quite useful for board members to think about as you think about what you should be expecting from your management teams, what you should be thinking about as you think about the next wave in this inflection point that we're all going through. So I thought I'd start off with just defining what an inflection point is. And my most recent book, Seeing Around Corners, was very much around this whole idea of strategic inflection points. And I draw on the work of Andy Grove, who published a fabulous book back in the 90s called Only the Paranoid Survive. And what he talked about as a strategic inflection points is a 10x change in something about your business that changes the assumptions on which your business was based. So if you think about it, any business is born at a particular point in history. It has things that were possible at that point and things that were not. And what an inflection point does is it dramatically changes the nature of that set of constraints that you're operating under, or opens up a set of possibilities for what you're operating under. So if you take something like YouTube, for instance, I mean, when YouTube was first commercialized, corporate leaders all over the world were not saying, oh my God, this thing is going to render media empires obsolete and it's going to change the nature of television and it's going to be the future of entertainment and people are going to be able to make a living, shooting silly videos of themselves. No, everybody when it first started thought about YouTube, cat videos. It still is largely cat videos. And so I think what we have to remember about inflection points is that in their early stages, they often don't reveal themselves. Now, the current COVID crisis obviously has changed so much about what we assumed would be the case in life that I think now we really need to be moving our attention to, okay, it's upon us. And how do we organize things so that our business can be taken to new heights and that we don't go into the trough that an inflection point can create? So how do we get around our own blind spots, as it were? So I think the first principle that's really important as a board member to remember is that any kind of information you're working with has three possible variants. The first is lagging information. These are lagging indicators. The information could be great information, but you can't change it. So most of the financial information that we use, even records about the crisis, were a month or 2 months out of date as we were trying to make decisions about the crisis, trying to decide what to do. So lagging indicators, there's nothing wrong with them, but they don't really tell you what's coming. Then we have current indicators, and current indicators are things like your employee engagement, your net promoter scores. They sort of tell you where you are right now. And those, again, very useful, but not really telling you very much about the future. They're telling you about today's state. The hardest kind of indicator to get a hold of is leading indicators. This is information about the future. Now, by definition, the future hasn't happened yet. And so the information that you can get about the future is often qualitative, right? It often can't be quantified. It often requires judgment. It often represents a future that reasonable people can disagree about. And I think that's one of the things that makes these leading indicators so interesting. And one final thing about leading indicators is a measure of their worth is not, did they predict what was going to happen? And just to illustrate this, remember back in the 90s, computer programmers all over the world realized that to save expensive storage space on digital systems all over the place had been published with only 2 digits as the year. And come the year 2000, computers all over the world were going to think it was the year 1900. And if you remember, the predictions were very dire. Airplanes were going to drop out of the sky and nuclear plants were going to become unstable. And we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. And of course, so the big moment comes, the year 2000. What happens? Nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? We took the early warnings really seriously. And there are a lot of critics right now who say we had plenty of early warnings that something like this pandemic could happen. In fact, as I understand it, there was a rulemaking body, certainly in our part of the world in Washington, that was about to pass requirements for hospitals to be pandemic prepared. And that was dismantled in the current administration. So there was actually a lot of evidence that had we heeded those early warnings, we would have been in a much better situation. And I think the analogy of the current crisis to Y2K is very apt, right? I mean, there are a lot of people even today who say, why did we make such a fuss over Y2K? Nothing happened. And that, of course, is one of the fundamental dilemmas of public health. When you take precautions and things don't go wrong, then everybody says, why were we getting so exercised about something that was never a big issue? Okay, so what we want to do is get a hold of early warnings and figure out how to take some action on them. Now, that's not so easy, because if you think about it, the strength of a signal in the early stages, the signal strength is very weak. And then what usually happens with an inflection point, it's very, very low. Then there's a period where it gains a lot of momentum. And then finally you've arrived, you have facts, you can take photographs. But of course, by the time you can do that, you're in too late territory, right? Because your degrees of strategic freedom will vary inversely to the quality of the information that you have to work with. And this is one of the fundamental frustrations of the strategist, right? By the time I know what the right answer was, the moment to take strategic action has passed me by. So what do we want? What we want is to be able to move back our decision time frame. Now, not too early, because the the signal to noise ratio is still very, very high. What we want, though, is to get into this period of what I call optimal warning, where you're not operating on just blind guesses, but you're also not leaving it too late. You are taking action in a substantial period of time. So what I'm going to do is, with the right to be wrong, right, is take you through an actual workshop style presentation that I would use if I was doing this for real, say with one of your board committees or with yourselves and your management team. So how do we the critical question is, how do we prepare ourselves to define a time zero event, something that is that moment in the future, which we want to be preparing for? And I'll show you the way that I do it. So what I do is I say, let's take 2 major uncertainties, which could have a big impact on our organization. And we're going to take 2 different future states of those 2 uncertainties. And by the way, you can repeat this for as many uncertainties as you want. I'll take just 2 because just for purposes of keeping this conversation manageable. Then what you do is you create a 2x2 out of those 2 uncertainties, and you tell a story about each resulting potential future. So the uncertainties I'm going to use are uncertainty number 1, whether we continue to have, at least in the US, an economy that favors shareholders and executives over a more broadly shared prosperity, or if this crisis actually does push us into a mode where we say, actually, no, we need either legislation or policy that insists that the prosperity be more broadly shared. So that's one dimension, right? So kind of new social contract situation as is. The other axis I'm going to use is the one that's on everyone's mind, which is, will our economies globally come back, or will they be I don't know why I did that. Or will they be? Will we have a sustained depression in our world economy, or will we have a relatively short cycle of pain, and then we go to a situation which is much more attractive? So if we juxtapose those 2, what we get are what I call stories about possible futures, and I've outlined 4. So let's take the sort of grimmest, where we still funnel all this money and resource to shareholders, and the global slowdown is quite prolonged. And I've labeled that scenario Les Miserables. People slip into poverty, profound economic insecurity, political instability, highly likely. Conflicts over resources, water, funding, clean air, become more and more intense. So that's kind of one scenario. Moving to the lower part of that grid, we now have the same sort of shareholder value, but the economy bounces back. And in that world, I think we kind of just see more of the same, right? It's rinse and repeat of the last 40 years, declining middle class, people with tremendous amounts of job and health insecurity, not a great situation. Now, moving over to the right, we have a different view of, call it stakeholder capitalism. That's what the Business Roundtable has called it. So stakeholder capitalism and prolonged global slowdown. There, I think we could be in for a Franklin Delano Roosevelt moment, where all the rules of capitalism that have been kind of released get reevaluated, and so as board members, you might want to be thinking about what would that look like? Like, how would a more equitable distribution of corporate resources look? And then, and the word I would use there is Franklin Roosevelt's Rendezvous with Destiny. And let's say the economy bounces back, but we have more broadly shared prosperity. That would be, I think, quite a desirable state for the majority of people. Now, I do think it's important to remind everyone that when I talk about future states, you need to make a big distinction between what you'd prefer to see happen and what you predict might happen. I have my own view about what I'd prefer. You probably have a view about what you'd prefer. But I think it's really important not to let your preferences get in the way of what you're predicting. And I, for one, have been absolutely stunned at the number of, future prognosticators who've said, oh, this economic crisis is going to lead to all this good stuff. We're going to have gender equality, and we're going to have, we're going to see the end of racism, and we're going to see, all these things, right? And yet evidence suggests that that there a lot would have to be in place for many of those outcomes to not come true. Okay, so we got our stories. Now what we do is we create a headline that would represent that story having actually happened. And that's going to be your time zero event. So in that first case I talked about, the headline is, why economic insecurity leads to collapse, right? Why economic inequality rather leads to collapse. And that's that political instability I was talking about. Headline in the second case is, extreme poverty returns, because we're not, we're just sucking more and more wealth up the food chain. It's not getting shared. In the kind of global slowdown stakeholder capitalism case, we've got the Rendezvous with Destiny, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's very famous speech that he made in the Great Depression, basically justifying removing a lot of corporate assets from private hands. He said, this is economic tyranny, and we're going to have to rethink it. Now, of course, it was interesting because Roosevelt he came from a very wealthy class. And so his fellows, absolutely hated him. They called him that man in the White House because he basically took assets away from wealthy people to distribute them more broadly and create the foundations of some of the social benefits that we have now. And then if you look at the Great Society 2.0, which is economy bounces back, more shared prosperity, those are all possible futures. Now what you can do is you can say, okay, if those are the four possible futures, and by the way, these are all real headlines, and these are all real possible futures. Nobody in this conference knows where we're going to land. I have a point of view about where I prefer we land, but that doesn't mean I think that's where we will. And I think each of these outcomes is plausible. The decisions that people like you, people in power, people with influence make over the next weeks and months are going to fundamentally determine which quadrant we land on. But these are all plausible. So what you would do is you would say, okay, for that given time zero event, let's work backward. Right. So let's say I was examining the case of the sort of Rendezvous with Destiny. So prolonged global slowdown, stakeholder capitalism returns. What evidence could I look for now that might suggest that's the future that we're headed for? Well, I think you've got some very interesting early evidence. You got, for example, in the U.S., you've got Labor is beginning to assert itself, and public opinion is beginning to say, wait a minute, these are people who are poorly paid, badly managed, have horrible jobs, but they're asked to put their lives on the line on a daily basis with inadequate protection from their employer. Well, if you think about it, it's a lot like the recognition back in the Great Depression that coal miners were putting their lives at risk for, working incredibly long hours and 6 days a week and so forth. So we're starting to see early versions of that. We're starting to see some limitation of the power of tech giants. So, for instance, Amazon has had its ambitions trimmed back in countries like France. We're starting to see, weak signals. Again, but that's what we want. We want weak signals that are early warnings, and then we want to construct sort of a time frame that says, okay, let's look at where these things are going. So, if I were to sort of map that out, right? If I map out the Rendezvous with Destiny model and we look at today, right, and we're looking at a very short time frame, right? So I'm saying January 2021. Let's assume that was the time zero we'd be looking for, and I won't go reading through all these, but what you could start to map out is 9 months before we can see these things starting to happen now, 6 months before, 3 months before, and so on. And of course, one of the major uncertainties for us is which way the politics is going to go. And that we just can't predict at this point. But you could lay out a scenario which would take us to that kind of rendezvous with destiny moment. So that's how you do it. You fix on a time zero event, work backward into what the indicators would be. You find your time zero event by mapping out a couple of uncertainties. And you could do this for several if you wanted to. And then work backward into, okay, what should we be looking for that would be evidence of this outcome rather than that? I think it's very practical, and it can be quite quick. You don't have to spend days and days and days on this exercise. Okay, I'll bring us toward closing with a couple of observations. The first is that as board members, increasingly you're going to find that you can't really talk about strategy without also talking about innovation. There was a time back when I started in the field of strategy, all the cool kids were doing, industry level analysis and all that kind of thing. And today, because I think competitive advantages have gotten shorter, what we're finding is innovation, the process through which we replenish our competitive advantage, through which we, increase the sources of future vitality. Innovations become absolutely critical. And so strategy and innovation really go together, and increasingly digital is a layer on top of that innovation layer. So I can't think of one conversation I've had in the last 6 months that didn't involve some form of digital innovation of some kind. So I think just bear that in mind, that you can't just separate out these things. They really are kind of mushing together in a very interesting way. So just some concluding thoughts. Most inflection points come gradually, early warnings, preparedness, and then suddenly. Blind spots can come from your past success. So what used to work, the recipes you relied on, don't work so well in every case. Most of the indicators you have to work with as board members are lagging, unfortunately. And so I would really push your management teams to make sure they provide you with at least some indicators that are future oriented. The strength of a signal is inversely related to the ability to change it. And it's really not about preparation. It's not about prediction, but being prepared. And then finally, I think the last encouragement is you really can do this. You can systematically identify early warnings. And I'll look forward to seeing how this all works in the questions. So if you would like to dig in more, my email's freely available. If you want to ask me questions, that's great. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a YouTube channel. I've got all that stuff. So feel free to pop in there. I also have a website called ritamcgrath.com with tons and tons of content on it. And a new thing I'm doing this year with the pandemic upon us is every Friday I have a fireside chat with somebody I think is just a really interesting person to learn from. And it's very informal. And we talk about what's on their mind, often their latest work or what they think is happening in the pandemic or so forth. Totally free. So feel free to join me there. And it would be great to see you. So with that, I will turn you back over to our hosts.
We've had some questions come in. The first one is, in your opinion, what do you think is the next event around the corner? And what advice would you offer to organizations undergoing a strategic review at this point in time?
So, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else does. What I do think we're getting to now, though, is a stage where, we've figured out we can't hide under a rock any longer. And so what I've outlined to a lot of my clients and the companies that I work for is essentially a 5-step process for what they need to do about their portfolios. And I'll just briefly go over it. And if you want to dig into any part of this, I'm happy to do that. First step is you really need to do a portfolio review, because in good times, and we've had 10 years of good times, there's a lot of stuff that accumulates. It's kind of like your closet, right? There's projects that are sort of zombie projects. There's lines of business that just are not really doing what you'd hope they would do. So you need to do a really thorough kind of portfolio review. And then, and the way I do this is just make a list of all the topics. The second step is to revisit your strategy, because chances are whatever your strategy was 6 months ago is not your strategy today. And out of that, what I then do is I derive some strategic scorecards. And a scorecard is just basically a way of identifying which elements of your strategy you're going to, in effect, grade your portfolio activities. And you go back to your portfolio, rank order them by the scores, right? Highest to lowest. And what that's going to give you is some candidates for what I call disengagement. Some things that, you could use your resources better if you took them out of those things. And then with those resources, the next step is to now pivot to the future. So now what you're doing is saying, okay, we've got some resource that we've preserved or we've found or we've extracted. Let's now go look where our opportunities are going to be present going toward the future. And then the last step is to really plan for those in a very learning rich kind of way.
Thank you, Rita. What are you advising boards with respect to how they not overwhelm management at this time with all of the need to look around the corner, but dealing with the crisis and getting the company back?
Sure. Well, I think there's levels, right? So there's a sort of Maslow's theory of needs, a level of how boards want to get involved. So at the sort of survival level, obviously, you have to make sure you're dealing with your employees safely. You have to make hard decisions about what are we going to continue to do when there's no revenue coming in. You have to make sure you've got the technology to support people. I mean, this whole thing has probably advanced the digital agenda probably by 5 years. I mean, just in a couple of months, it's amazing what is now going digital. But you can't let management teams wallow in that forever, right? There comes a point when, that's got to be kind of behind you and you need to move on then to let's think about the future. I mean, my advice would be to ring fence it. Like, don't be calling them every 15 minutes, obviously, but definitely make sure there's some time on the calendar, maybe a weekly touch base or a weekly catch up, where you say, okay, immediate crisis, got it, but let's think about what the future may hold. And if you look at the firms that are making these really interesting pivots, like Xerox going into protective equipment, who knew? And other large organizations that are actually finding opportunities in this recession, it's because someone in their governing bodies, kind of said to them, let's look at where there are opportunities and not so much the past. One thing I would caution you against is don't suddenly decide that innovation is the thing that's going to get cut. In fact, I was just on the phone yesterday with a group of innovation leaders, and they were, their concern is that it's easy to cut innovation, right? Because it's not producing current ROI, it doesn't contribute to the current crisis. We have no way of predicting when it's actually going to come through. But research very, very strongly suggests that firms that make it through some kind of business setback and have kept their innovation program going are able to access much brighter opportunities once that's behind them. And the thing about innovation I really want you to remember is it's path dependent. So if you cut it off, right, it's not easy to just flip a switch and turn it on again. There's a whole set of processes that have to be reinitiated. So, think very, very hard before you sort of end that function in your organization, even though I know it may seem kind of, not directly relevant to the crisis of the moment, but that's kind of the point. You want it to be relevant to the future.
One of the challenges with your model seems to be that there are so many plausible scenarios to look at, and much risk analysis looks at likelihood and impact of risks. How do you bridge those two approaches?
I would say there's no harm in using a couple of different ways of looking at the future. I think the thing that you want to be so a couple of things that my model tries to solve for. The first thing is that when you look at an organization that got itself into deep, dark trouble, so BlackBerry, let's just say as an example, and you talk to people who have worked in the company at that time, they will tell you. They will tell you they knew. In fact, talk about Nokia, the company I worked with for years. And I got an email from a person in Nokia who I really respect talking about what they'd done with their new ventures organization. Beautiful example of how killing off your new ventures group can really hurt you. And he basically said, look, the textbook creation of what they call their NVO, the new ventures organization, had been, they did so much right. And new guy comes in, financially driven, says, no. Now, any project that goes into there has to have a net present value calculation, and you have to give me an ROI. And basically, they shut down all the innovative things that Nokia knew how to do. And so 2006, I get this note from my friend basically talking about this. So early warnings, blaring red warning, warning, this is not going to be good. 2007, Olli-Pekka Kalasvuo, who's the CEO at the time, gets his picture on the cover of Forbes magazine. And the headline is, 1 billion cell phones. Can anybody catch the cell phone king? This was November of 2007. Now, 2007, iPhone had just been announced that year. Android had been commercialized that year. I mean, the writing was on the wall, and Nokia could not respond. And eventually they fell back on the excuse that, well, our manufacturing capability in places like China and Africa is going to be what saves us. Eventually went into a, sort of forced shotgun marriage with Microsoft. And eventually the entire handset division was let go. But you could see it in 2006. So why am I telling you this story? Someone in your organization right now has access to a vital piece of information that could teach you something about the future, but you don't have an organized mechanism for talking to that person. So what I'm proposing with this framework is if you work backward and you outline what the indicators are, then what you can start to do is have a cross-company, cross-function, and to ask the question, who would know about this? Right. So if I'm interested in, my rendezvous with destiny's scenario and thinking about what it means for my business, I would ask the question, who would know something about this information? And then maybe once a week, you have a quick phone call and just run through what's new. What's happening with these indicators? Has anybody seen or heard anything that's new? And it gives you that reach into the organization, which all too often is siloed off. People are not talking to each other, but I promise you somebody sees it early.
Do you think there are inflection points today regarding employee management? For example, working from home, work flexibility, compensation structures. Are we at a similar inflection point around those things?
I think, it's one of those questions. It's like some yes, some no. What's getting a lot of great press here in the U.S. is the statement that was put out by the government of Canada. And the first line of it was, you are not working from home. You are at home in a crisis trying to get work done. And I just thought that was so kind of empathically right, because for a lot of people, this, working from home if you don't have kids underfoot and you sort of are able to work portably anyway, and you have money in the bank, and you don't have to leave, that sounds idyllic, right? It sounds like a staycation. But for a lot of people, it's really not. And it's exhausting and it's overwhelming and it's tiring. So a couple of observations on your specific question. I think the first point is, if I'd asked you 6 months ago, would you all be willing to lay out money to equip all your employees with fast internet connections and make sure that they all had laptops and make sure that, all this stuff was put in place? That investment might have been looked at with favor, but it would not have been at the top of everybody's priority list, right? So come the pandemic, it went to the top of everyone's priority list. And now we've made that investment. And so I think, once you've made the investment, to go back to not using it anymore would be kind of foolhardy. So I think there's a lot of learning that's happening right now about what works from work at home, building teams, communicating, leading, and what doesn't. And so I think, it takes, I believe I read that it takes 66 days to form a new habit. So we're all busy forming new habits. And when things become open again, maybe some of those habits will stick. One thing that I think is really difficult for me to get my head around anyway is what a workplace would look like if people are worried about physically coming to a place and connecting with other people. I was on a call a few days ago with a the CEO of the company that publishes Inc. magazine and Fast Company. And he said, they're into contingency planning now. And he said, it's things like one-way corridors. You can't go up and down a corridor. You'll have to go like one way, and you'll have to have a socially safe distance behind someone so that you're not allowed to speed and walk too close to them. And you'll have to have very strict rules about things like the bathrooms. And, just when you think about what a pandemic friendly or pandemic, that sounds awful, but what a pandemically prepared workplace would be like, we're going to have to rethink so many things that I think the workforce management practices and others will be part of that great rethinking.
Many CEOs have developed communication strategies to their boards around results rather than leading indicators. Mm-hmm. And what would you be advising boards to do to persuade the CEOs to communicate toward leading indicators more so than strictly results?
Sure. Well, first of all, you're the boss. I mean, the board hires, fires, and determines the suitability of the CEO. So I don't think I don't think that's necessarily something you have to persuade them of. You can insist on it as a condition of their continuing to remain in that role. I would say, you can follow the example of Microsoft, which if you're looking for sort of a really good example. So what Satya Nadella did when he came into the leadership role at Microsoft was he realized his entire senior leadership team were being incented on past results, basically profits, sales, revenue, blah, blah. And so what he's done is he's now changed their compensation packages so that half of that comp is indeed the performance metrics is what he talks about them. But the other half is based on what he calls power metrics. And these are indicators of future success. So as an example, Microsoft's big pivot in the last couple of years has been to go towards cloud services. And when you're in a cloud services business, the business model isn't selling boxes, it's selling usage. Right. And so usage becomes a hugely important predictor of future success, because if I'm using it, I'm subscribing. If I'm subscribing, I'm likely to continue to subscribe. And that's a predictor of future success. Now, what drives usage? And he says, customer love. If customers have to love our products or they're not going to use them, because we're no longer in a monopoly world, right? There's lots of alternatives to what we have to offer. And what drives customer love? Empathy. And so he's been talking to his people about being empathic towards customers and helping them solve the everyday problems in their lives and improving people's productivity. And he's pivoted the whole company around that. So it's a very specific example of an organization that's determined to pursue leading indicators.
Well, Rita, this has been absolutely fascinating. I would love to have a longer discussion with you about equitable distribution of corporate resources and what the opposite of that looks like. And you made reference on a couple of occasions that we all have our own preferences and choices, and you have yours, and I'd love to hear what yours are at some point, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much. This has been a totally fascinating discussion and presentation. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Raul.
Great. Thank you very much, Ed and Rita. And Ed, I understand that a big storm out in New Brunswick that's impacted your technology. So thanks for bearing through that with us. Rita, some very provocative thinking. Thanks for sharing those ideas. And some of the takeaways, you can't predict the future, but you can prepare for it. And how important it is to be looking for weak signals and early warnings. Some really good takeaways, some great learnings that we can take with us today.